To understand the story of the first Thanksgiving, one must go back to the Protestant Reformation, which swept across Europe after Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in 1517. Thanks to the printing press, non-clergy had access to the Bible in their native languages for the first time. They began to question why the Roman Catholic worship services were so different than those of the primitive Christian church. The Reformation was slower to arrive to the British Isles, but England had its own split from the Roman Catholic Church in 1534 when King Henry VIII wanted a divorce and the Pope wouldn't grant it. The newly created Church of England was similar to Catholicism in every way, except instead of the Pope carrying divine authority, it was the British Crown. Every British citizen was expected to attend the Church of England, and those who didn't were punished by the state. One group of farmers in northern England, known disparagingly as the Separatists, began to worship in secret, knowing full well that it was treasonous. Once they decided that the only way they could be true to their conscience was to leave the established church and secretly worship, they were hunted and persecuted, and many of them faced the loss of their homes and the loss of their livelihood. When it became impossible for them to continue in this way, they began to seek another place to live. The Separatists first fled to the Netherlands, a wealthy maritime superpower that was far more religiously diverse and tolerant. But while life in Holland was peaceful, it wasn't English, and the Separatists feared that their children were losing their native culture. They decided that the only way to live as true English Christians was to separate even further and establish their own colony in the New World. Not all of the Separatists could make their cross-Atlantic journey, including their spiritual leader, Reverend John Robinson. William Bradford recounts a tearful farewell at the docks in Delfshaven, where a ship would take the Separatists to meet the Mayflower in London. Bradford didn't name his community Pilgrims and wouldn't have heard the term in his lifetime. The first usage of capital P Pilgrim appeared around 1800, when a group of citizens in Plymouth proposed the creation of a Pilgrim Society to organize the annual celebration of the founding of the Plymouth colony in 1620. Before 1800, the Separatists who landed at Plymouth Rock were known as the First Comers or Forefathers. The Pilgrims, led by Bradford, arrived in New England in December. Roughly half of the 102 passengers on the Mayflower died that first winter from starvation, exposure, and disease. With the help of the native people, the Pilgrims learned to fish and farm their new lands, resulting in the famous Feast of Thanksgiving, attended by natives and new arrivals in 1621. And then we have the Puritans. While the Separatists believed that the only way to live according to biblical precepts was to leave the Church of England entirely, the Puritans thought they could reform the church from within. Sometimes called non-separating Puritans, this less radical group shared a lot in common with the Separatists, particularly a form of worship and self-organization called the Congregational Way. The biggest difference between the Separatists and the Puritans is that the Puritans believed they could live out the Congregational Way in their local churches without abandoning the larger Church of England. The Puritans ultimately decided to journey to the New World too, but not for the same reasons as the Separatists. The Puritans, who already had some money, saw a favorable investment opportunity by owning land in America, and somewhat paradoxically, the Puritans also believed that by being far away from England, they could create the ideal English church. When the Puritans settled the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, they arrived in 17 ships carrying more than 1,000 passengers. They came with money and resources and divinely ordained arrogance. Just 10 years later, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a Puritan stronghold of 20,000. While humble Plymouth was home to just 2,600 pilgrims. Plymouth was fully swallowed up by Mass Bay just a few decades later. Because the Pilgrims and the Puritans share a similar backstory, their legacies often get blurred in the minds of later generations of Americans. So, did Pilgrims really wear black hats and buckled shoes? That popular imagery of the Pilgrims was dreamed up in the late 19th and early 20th century. Buckles were around in the 17th century but weren't Pilgrim fashion, and black dye would have been too expensive for the humble settlers. Only the wealthier Puritans may have worn black hats. Pilgrim clothing was likely very colorful, full of blues, greens, and oranges. I thought this article was very interesting. It was taken from the History Channel.